Well, hello everybody, this is Tim Green with Rattle Magazine. Welcome to the Critique of the Week for Friday, January 8th. Thanks everybody for joining me. It's always a pleasure to do these critiques of the week. Before we begin, let me just explain what we're doing here for anybody who's new. We always sit around every Friday afternoon and look at some poems and try to give as much feedback as we can to give people that experience of a creative writing workshop where you get to feel and hear what people actually think about your poems, how they're actually landing on their audience. And I think it's just one of the most useful things we can do as far as poets helping each other out. So let's sit around and do this. Hello to Mark Grenier over there on Facebook, Leah Iannone, Lisa Allison, Alawi David Opayemi, good to see you. Let's see who we have over on YouTube. We have E.H. Hampson, good to see you. Let's see. E.H. Hampson said there's an echo. Is anybody else getting an echo? Or is the sound good? I don't think. I only see two sound inputs here. Let's see. Yeah, I'm not seeing hearing anything else. Okay. Well, let's get rolling. Now, today's guest, like I mentioned, is James Tasillo. You might recognize James. He's been on Poetry Spawn Live and things like that. Okay, Mark Grenier says it sounds okay. Hege says it sounds okay. Okay, good. So maybe it's something with E.H. Hampson's audio setup there. Maybe you're watching in two places at once or something. Anyway, so we're looking at two poems by James Tasillo, and James is a poet who is frequently on giving a lot of good feedback on the Critique of the Week, and he's read poems on Poetry Spawn Live, so you might recognize, be able to conjure up what he looks like too as we go through. But let's get into this poem. We have two here, and let's take a look. The first one is My Memories, and it's the shorter of the two, so we'll maybe do this one more quickly. My memories of you are fireflies in a summer field, a starlit night dimmed by incandescent illumination. My sadness is a rising river, eroding the banks of my happiness. Your scent is wind drift snow piling up far away, the absence of your touch an avalanche of tenderness. The love you whispered in my ear is a thundering waterfall. The sway of your hips, a tide coming in, then going out, leaving me beach driftwood burning for you. That is My Memories by James Tasillo. And James asked too, so keep these two questions in mind. With his submission here for Critique of the Week, he said, I'm curious about the physicality of the poems. I also wonder if sometimes I overdo repetition of an idea in different images. So keep that in mind of what you think. As far as the physicality, I'm not sure what he means. I think he might mean the way it's centered on the page, which is one thing I wanted to talk about anyway. Now, poems aren't traditionally centered, and my advice is always to avoid that as much as possible. The main reason is because it's just not a common thing to do, and it sort of draws attention to itself in a way that usually you don't want to do. Because when I encounter reading a lot of poems, and as most of your poetry loving readers will do, it's unusual to see a poem centered. Then you think, why is the poem centered? And it's sort of a waste of thought to spend time thinking about why it's centered. This poem here, though, has a nice. Some of the time, sometimes there's a shape to the poem that sort of feels nice, and this poem kind of does. I'm not sure if it's supposed to be a specific shape, but if you sort of, I can't really step back, but if you look at the whole thing, maybe it's the shape of like a human being or like some kind of totem figure, which is kind of interesting. That it's a concrete poem as the style. The reason why, though, that the centered poems aren't sort of the norm for poetry is because it's sort of harder to read when it's ragged. Like it's a something that you maybe don't notice consciously, but not knowing where, because when you read a line, your eye scans across the page, then you have to dart back, and not knowing which sort of angle to dart back, and how far to go, actually in a weird way chops up the reading. And it's a distraction, I think. So unless there's a good reason to do it centered, I would avoid it. But this poem it feels nice that way. So I think it's something you could do, but it's something that I wouldn't do often. Now the title, My Memories, could be more interesting. It just reads into the first line, which for a poem, if the shape is supposed to be meaningful, which I'm sort of on the fence about, it might just sort of happen to be shaped this way, but there's these sort of like, I don't know, I'm kind of imagining a head and then a body and then legs and feet, but I don't know. But since it is like that, it kind of fits. To have a short title like that. What we always say about titles is that it should sort of contribute something to the poem. It should make it memorable. It should make it, you want to read, make you curious. And this poem doesn't really add much, but it does keep the shape and it reads right in, which can work sometimes too. My memories of you are fireflies in a summer field. So we start out, we know the you, we know the me, and then my memories of you. So we're really situated. We get the summer field. So we're set in the poem. We don't have to wonder where we are. We don't have to wonder who's talking to who, really. Because there's a me and there's a you, and the poem is addressing you. And then we're finding the field, we're in the field right away with the fireflies, so we get a visual. So we sort of have a little scene painted right away in these first 4 lines, which is in most cases, a good thing to do. A starlit night dimmed by incandescent illumination. Now, these incandescent illumination are sort of words that are a little bit much. They're sort of poetic, sort of feeling words, and they're adjectives, sort of heavy, and they don't really add to the scene in the same way as other things. Just like a summer field, like we can sort of see the summer field and the fireflies really easily. Incandescent illumination, just sort of over the top with its sort of size, the number of syllables, and so maybe find a more descriptive description here for those two. My sadness is a river rising. Or a rising river eroding the banks of my happiness. That's a really interesting concept. I like that. In both, it has this concrete feel to it because it's a rising river, and we can feel. And then there's the sadness eroding the banks of happiness, which is sort of a really interesting concept. It's easy to visualize, but then it's got layers to it, which is good. Your scent is wind drift snow piling up far away. The absence of your touch, an avalanche of tenderness. So when we get into this part, I don't know if this is what James was talking about when he said, I wonder if sometimes I overdo repetition of an idea in different images. But we're getting into this sort of just metaphor heavy, like my sadness is, the absence of touch is, the is dropped here, but it's the same structure. The love you whispered in my ear is, so we have this like metaphor. And it would be nice to break it up a little more, I think, and expand on the really good ones. So my sadness is a river eroding the banks of my happiness. And then instead of going to snow, why not the scent be something that relates? And sort of extend when you have an interesting metaphor instead of just jumping to different ones. So we're at a river and then we're at the snow, a snowdrift, and then an avalanche. So we're all over the place here. And I think it sort of ends up being a little repetitive. That's what I would say, just structurally, because we sort of know what's coming. So it'd be better to expand out a little bit on those ideas to break it up. Like my sadness is a rising river eroding the banks of my happiness, and then comma some details about it. The squirrels plant their seeds on its shores. I don't know what I'm saying, but you know what I mean? Like just expand and continue that out so we get it broken up. We don't know what to expect as much. I love you, whispered in my ear, is a thundering waterfall. The sway of your hips, a tide coming in, then going out. So here, and this is where I guess I was really thinking about how nice it would be to extend that really cool metaphor, because the rivers have tides when they reach the mouth of the body of water that they outflow into. And so the tide could be coming in and going out of that river that we talked about before. And so there's a real opportunity here to extend that and make it just more and more interesting as we extend that idea and make it more visual and have more things that we can apply that metaphor to. And so, and then the driftwood too. you know? I mean, rivers have sort of beach heads and things too on the banks. There could be driftwood, at least if it's close to the estuary or whatever. So this all could be combined, except for the avalanche and the snow. Most of this fits into one extended metaphor, which could really illuminate and open that up a little more. But in general, I wanted to say too, I think this is a really nice love poem. It's rare that, you know, it's hard to write love poems because there's so many. And I know we had a love poems issue back in issue number 43, I think it was. And it's tough to make them interesting in a new way. And with this metaphor here, I just love the sadness is a river eroding the banks of my happiness. And then what you can follow from that. I think that's a good thing to work with a little bit. So I think this would be a good start to a poem and just push it more at that metaphor. And that's my opinion of this one. The other one's longer and maybe has more to talk about, so maybe we can push ahead to the next poem and do more there. But let's see what everybody has to say. So Patricia Rockwood says, incandescent illumination is too much for me too. The sadness line pops up without preparation, says Mark A. Grinier. Let's see, Jeff Littlejohn, just me, but drop the illumination and make incandescence. Yeah, I think with these lines, I think you can sort of get away with one, but not two. Maybe that's the problem. So Jeff Littlejohn suggests cutting incandescent, and this make, he said drop illumination, sorry, and make that incandescence. So it would be a starlight night dimmed by incandescence. Yeah, and I think that would work. So I think that's a good suggestion from Jeff Littlejohn. Matt Install says, why incandescent anyway? And I'm imagining the fireflies too. Starlit night dim. So the night itself is dimmed, so it's sort of the opposite of what, since there's so little light, it's sort of taking away the darkness, which is how I read it, I guess, which I thought was an interesting concept too. Let's see. Matt Insel says, occasional use of ellipsis may address well, fit well with the shape intent, but mollify the centrality a bit, as in of you are fireflies. Ellipses are another one. There's another thing I should have said about the centering. When you're reading submissions, because usually, I'm going to be blunt here and frank for everybody who's listening. When you come across a poem that has centered text, because so many very inexperienced poets write with a centered text like this, you sort of assume that it's not going to be good. Like, we'll still read it anyway, but it's not a good first impression. You never get a chance to make another first impression, or whatever that expression is. And it's sort of like you assume it's not going to be a good poem because you can't help it. It's just habituation. You see 1,000 poems and the 100 that are centered are just not very, it's a very novice kind of thing to do. And so your first instinct is to assume that you're not going to get much out of what you read. And the same thing actually is with ellipses. Using a lot of ellipses throughout the poem to sort of guide the way. It's sort of what ellipses do in poems for sort of early writers. They sort of guide the sort of way you read in a way that maybe the background music does in like an action movie or something. I mean, I don't know if that's a good metaphor to use, but they sort of force you to read it in a certain way to overcome the fact that the emotions and the way of reading isn't played out on the page. So in the same way that the centered poem is sort of a red flag if you're reading submissions, a lot of ellipses are actually a red flag too. So unless you have a really good reason to do it, and maybe if you're doing it, do it all throughout the poem and have a good reason, but avoid it in most cases, because it's sort of a way to force a pacing that isn't there in the music of the speech anyway, if that makes sense. In a good poem, like just the context of what's going on and the rhythms of the language will tell you where to slow down and where the drama is. And so using ellipsis to sort of artificially force that in is just a sign that you couldn't control the music of the poem enough to let the reader know without doing that. And so that's something that I would always avoid if possible. Not that James Tasillo did, it was just a suggestion. It's worth adding because it's a similar kind of thing that happens with that. Let's see. Matt Insel says maybe dimmed by a backdrop of city light. I like that. So instead of incandescent illumination, Matt Insel says dimmed by a backdrop of city light. And that's a good, go instead of going to these abstractions, go to more image. Always go to more image, because we're building the scene that we connect to in our heads when we're reading. And having something tangible makes it feel more real, and feeling real is where the emotions come from. So instead of this, things that we can't really see, they're sort of more descriptors. That's a great suggestion to use dimmed by a backdrop of city light. Let's see. T.R. Paulson says, I like how honest this feels, but so much of the imagery doesn't feel entirely fresh. They feel like imagery I've seen before about relationships. I think if you picked a metaphor and extended it as Tim suggested, that would fix the problem. It is interesting that it's all water imagery. My favorite part is the wind drift snow part, because it feels like there's some irony there. Yeah, I wonder, another thing I thought, which as we were talking, since it is a lot of water imagery, and there's this whole water cycle thing going on too. We get the snow, and then we get the tide, the river, and then we get the tides at the end. There could be some way to make the metaphor move through that entire process. Like start with the snow, and then it melts, and then it goes to the river, and then it goes to the tide. And that could be the way to track the poem down the page, Like I remember just recently, what was it called? One of the stories we have, one of the little golden books we have is the tugboat. Scuffy the tugboat, yeah. And so you follow Scuffy from up in the mountains where some kid lets him go. He goes all the way past all the villages and through the logs and things, and out into the through the city under the bridge and out into the ocean before the man in the yellow hat, I think it is, picks him up or something. But that kind of thing I can imagine is being sort of a frame for the extended metaphor here, because you do the avalanche and the water, there's a way it could fit in an interesting way. The drift snow works, as T.R. Paulson says. So that's something else I thought of. Let's see. Mark A. Grenier says it begins in fire, moves through water, and ends in fire again. The pattern is interesting with the cold seas and water in the middle. Why? Oh, Jeff Littlejohn's a she. Sorry, Jeff. Let's see. Patricia Rockwood, exactly. Are love poems the best ones extol the loved one in an unusual way, sometimes without even mentioning the person at all? Yeah, you kind of have to hit it at an angle with a love poem. Just because there's so many, there's so many greeting cards. There's so many, a whole, romantic poetry, centuries of this kind of stuff. So it's hard to come up with fresh images and metaphors in a love poem. So you kind of have to do it in an unusual way. And maybe that water, is a frame that you could use, or just sticking to the river, which I like too, because the river is really interesting. And why how the sadness erodes the banks of happiness. I don't know, there's something interesting in there. So let's see. And Carlton Johnson says, consider a shape poem, i.e. concrete poem. The text could undulate like waves. It's a good suggestion. Terry R. asks, Tim, do you feel negatively about M dashes too? I do not. Emily Dickinson used dashes all the time. And, that's sort of it can be overdone. I think maybe I use them too when I'm writing like an email or something. But there's not the same. There's not the same, because a dash is like an undercut thought, or like a change of thought, or a cut, and cuts work, because also with an ellipsis, it's something's missing, it's usually something being left out, and so you're sort of, rather than revealing what you could say, you're sort of making us fill in the gaps, which isn't a really powerful thing to do. You want to fill it in with concrete stuff that we can feel. So that's part of the ellipsis problem too. I'm trying to think of if there were, if there are poems that I can think of that work really well and use a lot of ellipses, and I'm not sure. Let's see. Jimmy Papa says, could the river be eroding the banks of the river without mentioning sadness and happiness? That's an interesting idea. I mean, the sort of the landscape where the water is sadness and the land is happiness is sort of is what was interesting to me about that. But and then the other thing, I guess I should mention this too. I was trying to think of this as I was reading and forgot. You have this this is this sort of metaphor structure that we talked about. And one way you can get past that sort of repetition and the sort of monotony of doing the same thing over and over again with that is by doing what Jimmy Papa suggests here, by saying that by not actually putting the is in there, and just like this isn't going to work because it shifts. But if it didn't, you could say my sadness is a river rising, eroding the banks of my happiness, wind drift snow piling up far away, and not have the is and the your sense. So not having the signified and only having the signifier, and sort of letting us make that leap. And that's why you can stick with this sort of metaphors running the poem. It's a metaphor driven poem without it becoming a monotonous metaphor. Jimmy Pappas also says, I avoid what I call red flag words like firefly, stars, river, starlight, tenderness that increase the sentimentality. Sadness can be shown rather than told. Use more specific language. Yeah, that's another good suggestion. And that goes along with the lines with what I've been saying about the ellipses, which James didn't use, just to be clear about it, and the centering of the text. There's certain things that just are sort of red flags that this isn't going to be interesting. And in those words that Jimmy Pappas called red flag words, firefly, stars, river, starlit, tenderness, etc. They're just sort of overdone in a way that is a cue often that it's not going to be a very strong poem. Although I think the way they're used here works well in places. So I don't think you have to avoid them completely. You just have to be careful of not overdoing it. Okay, let me see. And so Mark A. Greener says there's something in the imagery here, but it doesn't feel completely worked out. This feels like it's the start of a good poem that hasn't quite been realized. Yeah. So that's my take on this poem. I like that river and what the water are doing. I think you could extend that out and maybe do it. There's some interesting ways you could do that. Let's look at the other poem, though. This was, I didn't mean to spend this much time on this one. Because this is, there's a lot more to this one. It's an interesting piece, and it's a lot longer, too. So let's dive into this, and maybe this will be a little longer than normal. So today I'm typesetting the next issue into the PDF format, and it's really boring. So we'll spend a lot of time on the critique of the week. That's okay. I'll use you all to procrastinate. Here's the second poem by James Tasillo again. He was an empty net at her soccer game. All syrup and no pancake at breakfast. He pushed an empty swing at sunset, moving nothing but air. His birthday cards never arrived. She couldn't remember him at her graduation. He may have stopped by later. His call never lit up her phone. Texts were inexplicably rare. At Christmas, he sometimes showed up like the ornaments at Walmart, a bit too early or later on sale. After she learned that he would forever be missing, she visited his apartment, which seemed like a museum displaying what he held dear. The kitchen counter was a sculpture garden of empty glass bottles, whiskey, wine, and vodka mainly. If they held anything now, it was his absence. She noticed a few pictures fixed by magnets on the refrigerator door. There she was on her bike, maybe 12 years old, wearing an oversized pink helmet and a smile. Another from when she and her twins visited 3 years ago, curious about their uprooted family tree. She opened the refrigerator and discovered a food desert, as well as an oasis of aluminum beer cans stacked and hoarded before an unexpected storm. In the living room, a guitar rested like an old friend against the sofa. The TV from the last century was untethered to a cable. She picked up a small, tarnished silver frame holding a picture of her mom in a hospital bed, cradling her in waves of cotton sheets and hopefulness. Another of her first birthday party, under the blooming crabapple with sunlight in her hair and sweet icing on her lips. In the bedroom, the unmade bed served as storage unit for rumpled jeans and balled-up T-shirts. Stocks were piled like cairns on the floor, the bedside clock unalarmed. The walls presented a haphazardly curated show. An unframed black and white photo held by brittle yellow cellophane tape shows her standing on tiptoe next to the Howdy Doody cutout at the roller coaster. She is at the center of a drawing with faded curled corners, holding a stick figure parent in each hand, as if they are balloons trying to float away. There was a Father's Day card she mailed when she was in college. "I'm getting married, Dad. Hope you can be there. Love you." And so many more. This isn't a museum, she thought. It is a small church in a neglected neighborhood, and she had been the God he prayed to for forgiveness. So that's a much longer poem, and I think it's an easier sort of poem to critique, maybe. I felt like with this poem, we have a really interesting structure and frame and a lot of good content. I really like this title. Great title. Because it does what all good titles should do. It sets, it's interesting and unusual and makes us curious to read. At least it does that for me. He was an empty net at her soccer game. And it's unique. It stands out from the crowd of other titles. And it leads into the poem, so it sort of sets it up a little bit. We don't know who the he is, but we get to learn pretty quickly. And then, so what? I think I won't go through line by line necessarily again in this poem, just because it's too long to go through line by line again. But I felt like it was very well structured and tells a really good story through visuals and through metaphors that work really well. I feel like it's too wordy, though, is the only thing. So let me try to find. So all syrup, I'll do a little bit line by line, and just to get the idea of this. So all syrup and no pancake at breakfast. She pushed an empty swing at sunset, moving nothing but air. So these are great images, and they're nice and concise in the way they should be to be strong. His birthday cards never arrived. She couldn't remember him at her graduation. I think maybe a dash or it needs more than a comma there. He may have stopped by later. His call never lit up her phone. Texts were inexplicably, so inexplicably is just a too big word. It doesn't really add much. At Christmas, he sometimes showed up like the ornaments at Walmart a bit too early or later on sale. This is great metaphor. So I love the first stanza. I don't really understand the difference between like the decisions to break out certain lines into, from the prose into the poetry. Like our next poet on the Rattlecast, Alexis Rotella, is a Japanese forms poet. She was the president of the Haiku Society of America and things like that. And she writes a lot of tanka prose and haiban, where you would do this, where you would have prose, sort of journalistic kind of journaling. I mean, like in the diary sense, diaristic, I guess I meant to say, diaristic prose. And then you have these haiku that are spaced out. But the thing is, the haiku, there's always like a shift in consciousness or something. A sort of a different state of like being in the haiku. Like there's a reason that the haiku are the haiku. They're just written into what's here in the text, you know what I mean? They sort of undercut and change and add an emotional layer or come at it from a different angle or something. And that's why they're pulled off from the prose. And with this poem, I didn't feel like it did that. Like I felt like eventually there's sort of this, I started to think maybe the pulled out into lines bits were all descriptions of pictures, but that doesn't really hold up either. Like, I'd imagine these were like supposed to be the actual pictures around the house, like on the refrigerator and stuff, but the first one doesn't do that, and there's one later that doesn't do that. So I just couldn't make sense of why certain things were pulled out like this. And I wonder if it might work better. Really, I would like to see that it'd be nice to have it be kind of like a haiga. Or like, just look at I think James is a subscriber, so he can pull up Alexis's poem right now that was a finalist for the Rattle Poetry Prize. I can't remember what it's about. I remember a yoga instructor and 9/11 and a flight. There's some story there about 9/11, but see how she uses the haiku sections to sort of illuminate the prose sections. And it would be really fun to do that with this, because I think what we have is a really good story that's well told in an interesting way, but doesn't really fit with its format. So I would look into doing that and making what you pull out unique in a way. Another idea too, though, is to use like I thought was going on for a while, is to use the verse lines as just like the photographs, like just descriptions of the photograph in this format, so that we kind of see them dotting the poem like they dot the house. And in which case you would not include this here. This is just more prose, really, for some reason pulled out. Anyway, after she learned that he would forever be missing, she visited his apartment, which seemed like a museum. So here we get this, after she learned he would be forever missing. That is such a long, clunky way to say he died. And there's a lot of words and syllables in there. And it would be so much more powerful. You could just cut, after he died, she visited his apartment. It seemed like a museum displaying what he held dear, and just get rid of all that clutter, like cut right to the heart of what, cut to the bone of what you're talking about. And that's kind of the main, other than I'd like to see, I think it'd be cool. Like, it's really good prose. And I think it'd be cool to see those poetic elements pulled out, like one of those haiga series that we've published a whole bunch of them too. Like Kenny Tenemura has one, and that goes on for a while, like this, where the haiku interspersed in our Japanese forms issue. So if you look back to that, you can find it. There's a bunch of them we've published, and a bunch you can find all over the place. I think if you look at Frog Pond or Modern Haiku online, they have at least one haiga. I mean, Haiban. I hope I've been saying Haiban. Haiban, Hiban. They have one in their web sampler every issue, so you can check out the various ways people do that there. I think that would be a great form for this. And there, though, the key is to have the haiku be something different, though. It undercuts. It would be like unrelated. So keep an eye out for that and see how that works, because it really adds a lot to this kind of writing. I think it's a great form. Anyway, the kitchen counter was a sculpture garden of empty glass bottles, whiskey, wine, and vodka mainly. So here, another example of the clutter. I think you just cut the end it here, and cut the mainly. The mainly is such a cluttery word. So if you just said the kitchen counter was a sculpture garden of empty glass bottles, whiskey, wine, vodka, boom, and you're done, without that extra clutter. If they had held anything now, it was his absence. She noticed a few pictures fixed by magnets on the refrigerator door. There she was on her bike, maybe 11 or 12 years old. Like, why maybe? Like, that's another clutter. Just say 12. Even if you don't know, just it's just info. Just get it out there. Wearing an oversized pink helmet. And a smile is like one of those words that Jimmy Pappas called a red flag word. If you're going to use a smile, make sure you use it in a good, interesting way, because it's sentimental and usually doesn't have a lot of emotional weight because it's such sort of simple sentiment. But I think wearing an oversized helmet, there could be a more interesting description, something unusual. Like, pull out something more than just the oversized helmet. Like, what does the oversized helmet do? What does it look like? Use a metaphor or something, and get rid of the smile, because it doesn't really have a lot of weight to it. Another from when she and her twins visited 3 years ago, curious about the uprooted family tree. I'd rather have a description of the picture than this explanation. And maybe tell a little bit, through how you describe the picture of what you're trying to get through here, because this is just sort of more content dumping. She opened the refrigerator and discovered a food desert as well as an oasis. So here, another one, clutter, a food desert. Cut that and just make it a comma. See how much better it reads? She opened the refrigerator and discovered a food desert, an oasis of aluminum beer cans stacked and hoarded before an expected storm. That's a really great image there. The desert, the desert of the refrigerator and this oasis of aluminum beer cans. I like that too. There are a lot of great descriptions here. In the living room, a guitar rested like an old friend against a sofa. That's good too. I like that. The TV from the last century was untethered. And again, this is another sort of more syllables than it needs. The TV from the last century was untethered to a cable. How about just another fragment here, but just like a comma or something. The untethered TV from the last century, or an untethered TV from the last century, and then end it there instead of the to a cable and the was. She picked up a small tarnished silver frame holding a picture of her mom. So again, I thought maybe that would be descriptions of the pictures that she picks up in these stanzas, but then she's actually, the subject here is in this one, so it doesn't really fit. Like there's no consistency to why these are pulled out. Like if you pulled this up to here, then it would kind of fit that form. Anyway, a picture of her mom in a hospital bed, cradling her in waves. And the cradling is another one of those words, a red flag word, I would say, that Jimmy Pappas pointed out. I guess we are going through line by line. What the heck? Let's see. Another of her first birthday party under the blooming crabapple with sunlight in her hair. So sunlight is what T.R. Paulson was talking about, kind of, images you've seen before. So make these interesting if you're going to describe the pictures. In the bedroom, the unmade bed served as a storage unit for rumpled jeans and balled-up T-shirts. Socks were piled like cairns on a floor. I like that, too. That's really good. Good stuff there. The bedside clock, unalarmed. I thought that was a little forced. In a different poem, I think that'd be a cool line, but it doesn't really fit. It's like a little too clever for this poem. This poem is a more straight, sort of honest, not clever kind of poem, I think. And so the bedside clock unalarmed, maybe that's a line to save for another poem where you're using that kind of, pun, clever type voice. The walls presented a haphazardly curated show. Haphazardly, maybe the wrong word choice there. Maybe something that's a little simpler than haphazardly. An unframed black and white photo held by brittle yellowed cellophane tape shows her standing on tiptoe next to the Howdy Doody. And why the line break there, I wonder? Howdy Doody cut out at the roller coaster. I would just get rid of, I think, the more I read this through, the more I like the idea of turning into a haibun and letting poems, little short poems, be like their own thing, sort of separate, like undercutting what the prose narrative is. She is at the center of a drawing with faded corners, holding a stick figure parent in each hand as if they're balloons trying to float away. I like that. That's good, though. There was a Father's Day card she mailed when she was in college. I'm getting married, Dad. Hope you can be there. Love you. That's really sad. And that's a good detail because of how much, how sad that is. There's a lot of emotion in that detail there. And so many more. This isn't a museum, she thought. It's a small church in a neglected neighborhood. So I like that idea. And a lot of times I would say that you want to let the reader draw this kind of conclusion. But there's a way that's such a great metaphor, that this isn't a museum but a small church. I really like that. So I would sort of leave that. And she had been the God that he prayed to forgiveness. I think this part is too much, though. So I think maybe just leaving, this isn't a museum, she thought, but a small church in a neglected neighborhood. And maybe get more abstract just at this part, so we let a little room for the reader to move, I think. And so instead of she being the God, just say, why not, this isn't a museum, she thought, but a small church in a neglected neighborhood where people pray for forgiveness. And what if you leave it that open-ended? Or maybe not people, but you know what I'm saying? Like some kind of like pull back from the story so that there's a little bit not told, so that we're not like given everything and we can participate a little bit in the poem as a reader. So I like this a lot. I think it's really good prose and a good touching story. And so I liked it. I would just like to see an attempt at doing some haiga or haiban. I keep saying haiga. Haiga is a picture with a haiku. But I would like to see it that way. But at least you could find a reason to make the verse parts unique, and that would spruce up and make the poem more interesting. I've been talking a lot. Let me see. Let me see what other people are saying. Let's see. So Mark Cunningham says the one praying is the father in the end. Yeah, exactly. The father's praying, to the daughter who he abandoned. I mean, that's the story we're getting. I would just like to, like when I say there's, I've used this metaphor before, but you're dancing with the reader, you're leading them, but you're not dragging them around the dance floor, And so just having a little bit of room to wonder at who the father is. I mean, at who the praying person is, to say, oh, it's the father who's the one praying. And so saying she had been the God that he prayed to tells you everything you're supposed to draw, like every conclusion you're supposed to draw from the poem. But just saying this isn't a museum but a church where people pray for forgiveness, that lets you say, oh, it's the father who's praying for forgiveness to the daughter. And that lets us participate, which lets us engage more emotionally, because we're a part of the poem. Because the trick of a poem is really that it makes the reader be a part of the experience. It's that sort of extreme empathy, because the poet is using your breath as their medium, and so you're becoming the speaker, and getting to participate in that a little bit is a really powerful. It makes it a powerful experience. And so not telling us that it's the father and the daughter here at the very end, I think would make it a little bit of a stronger ending. That's what I was getting at that point. Carlton Johnson points out the cotton sheets and hopelessness doesn't work for me, which is down here. And that's, again, I think this is both what T.R. Paulson said and what Jimmy Pappas said with the red flag words and the things you've seen before. It's sort of a combination of both. So make images original as original as possible, and avoid the sentimentality, because this doesn't have weight. So I think that's probably the reason why. Yeah. Anyway, let me see. Matt Install says that I mentioned cutting the haphazardly curated, and Matt says, I'm not sure merely removing haphazardly maintains that quixotic effect. And I kind of agree. Like, it needs something. I just felt like haphazardly was a little of a clunky word to say. It sort of broke up the flow. Like I was just talking about on like the musical level. The Walls presented it's a haphazardly curated show. It's kind of hard to say, And so something a little more mellifluous would be nice there. I'm not sure what other options you have. And maybe just, moving the syntax around so that it doesn't appear quite in that order would make it a little less clunky. But it's hard to make your mouth move. It's like you have to be a gymnast to come up with those sounds in that order. Let me see what else people are saying. Aaron Cloyd says that the ending explained too much. Yeah, I got into that later. Sherry Puff says, I think these pullouts are intended to be the pictures. Some are photos, some are drawings, except for the card. But maybe the card is displayed as a picture. I don't think let's see, is this the first one? Because I think the first one ruins that theory, doesn't it? After she learned that he would forever be missing, this is just telling the story. And it's pulled out and centered. I mean, I guess it's different because it's centered instead of to the right or left. But But that's why I didn't think that was true. And then other things show a little too much of action. I think I can't remember where it was. Anyway, I think that if that's the intention, I think it should be cleaned up a little bit and make those really concise, like just really powerful descriptions. Let's see. Patricia Rockwood says could be an effective prose poem. Yeah, I like the prose. I guess another thing I'm trying to say is that I like the prose a lot, and I don't think the poetry lives up to it. So I don't know. I mean, it's really effective as a prose poem. I think maybe just playing with a format is a good thing to do. Let's see. Yeah, so we're all talking about the same kind of things. It'd just be better as a Hyben or something would be really good. Patricia Rockford says format is not easily understandable. Yeah, I think it's just a formatting problem with this. Oh, here Mark Gurner has a theory that prose seems to mark the present and the verse marks the past. Times of absence and emptiness alternating with scenes of love. Yeah, maybe that's what it's going for. Does that work? But we're in the present when she picks up the small tarnished frame. I mean, I guess it's sort of, Mark is saying that it's sort of like a flashback, like doo-doo-doo-doo-doo-doo, and then it's like blurry and black and white or something, and we're seeing the past. And maybe, it's not clear what it's doing. That's a good idea, though, for what it could do, is to be sort of like, think of it, instead of thinking of it as these picture descriptions, like think of it as an actual flashback, and maybe that would make sense in a way that isn't distracting. Because right now it's distracting from the good story more than it's doing anything, adding anything. Yeah, so I think everyone's pretty much just saying the same thing. We like what we like, and it needs some work in the ways that it does. Terry R. says maybe something like it is a small church in a neglected neighborhood filled with prayers for forgiveness. Oh, that's a good one. Yeah, I don't know if you heard that. That's over on YouTube. So James, make sure you check the comments there to see exactly. It is a small church in a neglected neighborhood filled with prayers for forgiveness. And that completely removes the subject and lets it be a little more open and airy. Let's see. Jimmy Papa said, now this is different. I was immediately drawn in by the shape, like it was a different poet. Okay, I think that might be it for today. We went a little long because they were some interesting poems, and I'm procrastinating, but that's okay. Glad everybody could stay and enjoy this. I think that is all. Yeah, let me see. Oh, people are trying to, Aaron Cloyd and Sharon Ferrante and Matt Insel are trying to think of ways to make that haphazard line work. So some suggestions are, instead of the walls presented a haphazardly curated show, Sharon Ferrante says a lacking curated show. Maybe a show lacking curation. Aaron Cloyd, the walls, a curated but haphazard show. I like that too. That's better. That was Aaron Cloyd's suggestion. And anyway, okay, I think that's good. I think we had a good critique. These are really two poems that are worth working with and had a lot of things to say. So thanks for that, James Tasillo. Always a pleasure doing these. Just a reminder to everybody, if you would like to participate, there's a category on Submittable, and you just submit there, and once a month I pull out 4 poets or 5 poets for the next month. I'm using a random number generator on the last show of the month. So if you'd like to have one of your poems critiqued like this, people always ask for feedback when we reply to submissions, and we just can't because I have, we get about 200 or 300 a day. So feedback is impossible, but with the critique of the week, we get to do it once a week. So send your poem there if you would like to participate in that way. Now, next week's guest, I should say too, the open mic's coming up, of course, on Sunday. As always, we will have an open mic for poems about current events at noon Eastern Time, 9 a.m. Pacific. On Sunday, so that's for Poets Respond Live. We'll try to get the poet of whatever poem we pick. So submit your poems tonight if you'd like it considered for Sunday's poem. And either way, you can share it on Sunday. And then next week's guest, as I already mentioned, there's Alexis Rotella. Her newest book, it is all Tonka, not Tonka prose like we were talking about, but I've seen other stuff of hers that is. So they call it Hyben if it's prose with haiku, and they call it tanka prose if it is prose with tanka. And Alexis Rotella does a lot of that, so we'll be talking and sharing a lot of her work, including her newest book, Dancing, the Tarantella, and she has this Tanka 2020 anthology, which is pretty cool. That is Tuesday, January 12th, 9 p.m. Eastern Time. The prompt for this week is, let me look it up really quick. The prompt for the Rattlecast open mic was a circus with no audience. So write a poem this weekend about a circus with no audience and share it on the open mic after we talk to Alexis, Tuesday, January 12th, 9 p.m. Eastern Time. Hope to see you then, and thanks again for everybody for doing this critique today, and thanks to James Tasillo for sharing his poems. Have a good weekend, and I'll see you Sunday, hopefully. Bye.